Welcome to It's Bloody Complicated, the Compass podcast. I'm Neil Lawson, your host and director of Compass. Joining me to help manage the questions is Grace Barnett from the Compass office. Hello, Grace.
Hello.
These are unprecedented times, and we need to rise to the new and enormous challenges we now face. Over the next few weeks, we'll be speaking with writers, thinkers, politicians, journalists and public service workers about how we come out of this mess in much better shape than we went in, a good society after COVID-19. These conversations have live access for Compass members who can put their own questions directly to our guests. If you'd like to participate in a live call and help support all of our work, go to compassonline.org.uk/podcast to join Compass today. Otherwise, sit back, relax and enjoy this week's podcast. The virus impacts on everyone, but it impacts on them differently. Joining us this week to discuss the crisis and the future of progressive politics is Guy Standing, one of the world's leading thinkers and campaigners for basic income, the payment of money to everyone, forever, with no tie, for people to do what they want with. But Guy isn't just a leading thinker about basic income, but also about the nation of the commons, the place of the precariat, and has a strong interest in deliberative democracy. So, Guy Standing, it's absolutely great to have you on the call tonight. Tell us, first of all, where are you and how are you?
Well, it's great to be talking to you, Neil, and it's an interesting subject, so we'll try and get through a lot, no doubt, in the next few minutes. I'm in Switzerland, and the reason I'm here is for many years I worked fairly senior levels in the International Labour Organization and in other UN organizations, and it was during that period that I developed my perspective on the subjects we're going to be talking about rentier capitalism, flexible labor relations, the growth of the precariat, and most of all, basic income. So I have a sort of base here, which I've kept since I left the UN.
And I asked you, how were you? How are you in the lockdown?
Well, as a matter of fact, it's had pluses and minuses. And I think that we've got a new class divide that's opened up in the world. Those people who have gardens and those people who don't have gardens. I think it's much easier if you've got a small garden and you can grow your own vegetables and reconnect with nature and slow down. Many of the values behind the support for basic income, one reconnects with them. And I've seen pluses. There are obviously great negatives, including probably drinking too much, eating too much, and not doing enough sport. But I've been able to do a lot of work, and there's been such a fantastic increase in the interest in basic income from all over the world that every single day I get requests for media interviews and all sorts of Zooms and things. It's been an incredibly intense period of work, and this surge of interest is indicative of where we are in this debate.
So we're going to move from the sans culottes to the sans jardin. Is that, my French isn't very good, Grace will correct me, but those without gardens, this is the future. Tell us a bit about you, Guy, and your kind of academic, political, activist thinking life, so people can kind of locate you and place you. And is it true? I've heard a rumour that you're 72. Is that rumour anywhere near correct?
I'm not going to confess to anything you suggest. What a horrifying... Nobody aged 72 should be allowed out.
I think that's it. They should just be prey to COVID and shut up.
Anyhow,
yeah.
But
a bit about
very, very, very briefly, I did my PhD in University of Cambridge, and at the time I did it, that was still a very radical centre of economic thought. We had many of the great Keynesians who are still alive, many Marxists and people who were my tutors like Joan Robinson and so on. And I came out just at the time when Margaret Thatcher and the neoliberalism was coming into fashion, built on the Mont Pelerin Society, and Cambridge was really savagely attacked by Thatcher. And that has molded my politics and my activities ever since. And I went to work in the International Labour Organization, initially for a very short period. I had a series of temporary short-term contracts over quite a few years. And I worked up and became Director of Labour Market Research. And then when the Berlin Wall came down, I was made director of ILO operations from the Soviet Union and the Eastern Europe. So I worked there with a big team, quite a lot of resources in terrifying conditions. And then after that, I had the enormous privilege of being invited to be director of research for Nelson Mandela's Labour Market Commission. And so I worked on reforming labor and social protection in South Africa. And we were defeated by the IMF and a program called GEAR. But I presented my report to Mandela in his own house. And I remember him saying to me, he said, you know, winning the peace is much harder than winning the war. And he was too old and frail by 1996. And Mbeki had the same problems and had other problems as well. But that was a great period. And then I was also involved in working in the tsunami areas, developing social research, where I was advocating basic income again. And same as in South Africa and in Russia after 91. And at each point, I thought we had a chance to have a basic income. We needed basic income, but the forces from neoliberalism and the forces of the IMF and structural adjustment and shock therapy were against it. So after that, after leaving the ILO, I became professor at University of Bath, professor of Monash University in Australia, and then at SOAS, University of London. And now I'm mainly working on my books and being involved as an economic advisor to John McDonnell the last 2 or 3 years. And it's been an engaged period. And at the moment, I'm feeling that we now have a 50% chance of having a basic income introduced. And that's a big change from what it was when I started working on it. And when we set up BIEN, the Basic Income Earth Network, which was in September 1986. We now have thousands of people who are members of BIEN all over the world. And suddenly I find we've got a lot more friends. For a long time, I was in tiny minority and people would say, well, what is a basic income? What on earth are you talking about? Now, suddenly, we have an extraordinary array of people coming out in favor. And it reminded me of a talk I gave at the Brazilian Senate a few years ago when I first spoke in the Brazilian Senate in 1997. They all laughed at the idea of a basic income. The next time I talked there, a whole lot of senators came down the aisle and said, I was the first to support basic income in Brazil. So I said, well, happy is the child who has many godfathers, because he will get lots of Christmas presents. And I had a lovely private meeting with Lula, who was still president then, and he said he only was re-elected. He really felt he'd only been re-elected president because they had moved towards having some sort of basic income. It's called Bolsa Familia. It's not very close to what I would call a basic income, but it was certainly moving in that direction. So we've seen a tremendous change in the climate of the discussion around basic income.
So take us back to the fundamentals, and if you can, some people on the call and some people listening to the podcast, won't understand the basics of basic income. So just tell them, if you could, define what it is, and then begin to say, why you support it as strongly and as passionately and as effectively as you do, Guy.
Yeah, well, I wrote a little book that came out last year called Plunder of the Commons.
You have a book coming out every year, don't you, Guy?
Yeah, something like that. It's just been all of my thoughts from working in the UN when I couldn't write and publish have all come together. But the Plunder of the Commons attributes the idea of a basic income to the Charter of the Forest, which is a foundational document of the British Constitution. It came out the same day as the Magna Carta on November the 6th, 1217. And the 10-year-old king didn't know what he was doing when he was accepting it, because it was the most profoundly subversive charter in British history, certainly. And basically what it did was it said that everybody, every commoner of England had the right to subsistence and the right to access raw materials in order to have subsistence in the commons. And it was a fundamental document that said that we have a right to a basic income as people, as citizens. And I trace it back to that. But I've always argued that the fundamental reasons for a basic income are ethical. And to understand that, I'm saying basically what we believe in when we say basic income is that everybody as a right of citizenship, as a right of legal residence, should have the right, the economic right to a modest basic income paid without conditions, paid individually, not as a household basis, which is an endogenous variable, and paid that non-withdrawable, so you can't have it taken away, and it should be paid in a way that you can make decisions on how you spend the money. Okay, so that's the fundamental definition of it, and the ethical reasons are first and foremost that it's a matter of common justice. It's a matter of common justice. If you allow private inherited wealth, which every single government does, it's money and wealth, something for nothing. You haven't done anything to deserve that money. So when anybody like Ian Duncan Smith says giving a basic income is something for nothing, I will say in that case, you must be in favor of abolishing private inherited wealth. But a basic income recognizes that all of us, every single one of us, our income and wealth is due to the efforts and achievements of the many generations that went before us. And if you allow private inheritance, then we should allow social inheritance. And a social inheritance which is given to equal amounts for everybody. It's a social dividend. And I went to Middlesbrough when I was presenting the previous book on basic income. And it taught me a profound lesson. If you go to Middlesbrough, you realize when you're there that it was the hub of the Industrial Revolution. It began there when a little hamlet when they discovered iron ore. And that iron ore went to build the railway systems of Britain, of India, the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge, and in Sydney, the Sydney Bridge, all were built with iron ore from Middlesbrough, that area. If you go to Middlesbrough today, it's wretchedly poor. It has a bigger precariat than practically anywhere in Britain. And at the same time, the toffs that made the money from the profits from the industry there all moved south and have big estates, and descendants of those people go to Eton and they go to privileged universities and so on. And the people who created the wealth are languishing in insecurity and poverty. In a sense, you can see the rationale for having an equal basic income in a place like Middlesbrough. It brings it home to you. For me, it's also a matter of social justice, a matter of religious justice, if you believe it. If you believe in religion, you could say that God has given us unequal talents, and having a basic income is a sort of compensation for those who haven't got the top talents that make money. All right. So that's one ethical justification. The second is that it would enhance freedom. We've done pilots in various parts of the world, and every single pilot in which I've been involved in, the major thing that comes through is that the emancipatory value of a basic income is greater than the money value. I explain that in the results in the books, but what it means is that you have the ability to say no to an oppressive spouse or partner, no to an oppressive employer, no to an exploitative relationship. And that power to say no is really emancipatory and important. One of our pilots found that after a few months, a lot of women were leaving relationships. And I remember some critics saying, well, look, that leads to family breakups. And then further research showed that there were women leaving abusive relationships because they had a little money, they had a little assurance that they could get by. That sort of emancipation is very powerful. It also gives stronger bargaining position. That's why I wish unions would understand that if you have a basic income, you can bargain against an exploitative employer from a stronger position, and you're more likely to join trade unions, as we've seen. Okay. And the third justification is it would give everybody basic security. And that, for me, today, in this pandemic, is absolutely vital. And the basic security is a public good, and it's a superior public good. We all need basic security. And you having basic security doesn't deprive me of it. In fact, if we all have basic security, the value to all of us goes up. But if you have a situation like we do today, where some people are insecure, while others are being protected, the pandemic will roll on and on and on. We'll probably come back to that. So for me, the justification for basic income are fundamentally ethical. But in this pandemic, they've become an economic imperative.
And do you think, I mean, as awful as the pandemic is, you know, whatever it was going to take, it had to become that economic instrumental thing that cracked open the basic income debate? Because I think, you know, I agree wholeheartedly, and I love hearing you talk about it because you do it so brilliantly well on moral and ethical reasons, which are very close to the heart of Compass. But it was always going to be an issue of efficacy eventually that would tip this into the mainstream, and that is now happening, I think, isn't it?
Well, you don't want a boring speaker who keeps referring to his books, but as it happens, the book that came out in March takes that question and answers it. And I think it's because of that that I'm getting these requests for interviews everywhere, because the argument of the series I've written is that we've gone from a situation from neoliberalism. We don't have a neoliberal system. I think the word is overused. It morphed into one of rentier capitalism. Rentier capitalism means that more and more of the income is going, and wealth is going to the owners of property, physical property, financial property, and intellectual property. And as it did so in the 1990s through the crash of 2008 and ever since, the share of income going to people who work and live has gone down and down and down. It's a global thing. It's a global thing. And the precariat has evolved from the development of rentier capitalism. And what I've done in this new book, which emanated from a report I did for John McDonnell beginning of last year, is that the rentier capitalism has generated what I've called 8 giants, going back to the imagery used by William Beveridge in his famous 1942 report, where he was talking about the need to slay 5 giants. And he said it was a time for revolutions, not action, his famous expression that he said. And I believe that we've reached that stage now, because the 8 giants had created such a fragile economic system that it only needed a trigger to lead to a slight downturn where the whole system would crash to a much greater degree than in 2008. That's the theme of that book, which was obviously written before the beginning of the pandemic. And the 8 giants that have grown are first and foremost inequality. And Britain has an incredible degree of inequality today, and it's much more about wealth inequality than it is about income inequality. And wealth has risen relative to income. It used to be that wealth was about 300% of GDP. Today, wealth is over 700% of GDP. And 60% of wealth is inherited. In other words, most wealth has not been earned, it's been gifted. And that wealth inequality and the income inequality is fostering all the other giants. And the second giant is insecurity. Insecurities of many varieties have mushroomed in the last 20 years. Millions of our fellow citizens feel chronically insecure, and that was before the pandemic. The third giant is debt. And for me, debt is what has created this pandemic slump. If you think about when the Spanish flu took place in 1918, 1920, US private debt was about 50% of GDP and corporate debt was non-existent. So that when the pandemic came to an end, the economic engine could take off fairly quickly. Okay, it's a slight exaggeration, but it's essentially that story. But today, before the pandemic struck, private debt in the United States was over 150% of GDP, and corporate debt was 3/4 of GDP. And in other countries, it was very similar. We have incredibly high unsecured private debt in Britain. So that even if you have a small downturn, it's going to lead to millions of people being unable to service their debts. And unless we protect people in the lower end of our income spectrum, you're going to see homelessness shooting up, suicides, deaths of despair, and so on. And that's the fourth giant. And this too was also a pandemic before the pandemic struck, and that's a pandemic of stress. We had rising morbidity, we had rising social illnesses, we had rising inability to avoid suicidal tendencies, all of the mental stresses that existed before and have been intensified now because we're not giving people security. And then the fifth giant is the one that I've written much about, and the one that draws me to receive thousands of emails from people who say, that's me you're talking about, and that's precarity. And precarity isn't the same thing as having unstable jobs, insecure jobs. It's about feeling you're a supplicant. You are losing rights in the state. You are losing the capacity to be a citizen. You are facing the indignity of having to ask for favors, be it from universal credit bureaucrats or landlords or relatives or friends, and not finding it. And you are reduced to being a denizen. This sense of precarity is a powerful giant that's shadowing our society. And the sixth, of course, is the robots. I don't think we're all going to be made jobless or workless, but it is disruptive. The automation, the technological change is disruptive, increasing inequality. And the seventh giant is the one that I believe will lead to millions more joining the campaign for basic income. And that is the threat of extinction. It's the number one challenge once we get through this COVID-19 slump, because that extinction threat is marching towards us. And a lot of people are linking this COVID pandemic to the fact that we have abused nature. We have abused our relationships with nature, and we've lost the balance with nature. And I think that giant is going to demand that we have eco-taxes, we change our tax system, carbon taxes, but they will only be acceptable if we recycle the revenue from eco-taxes as social dividends, because otherwise it's regressive. The final giant, you'll be glad to hear, but then I'll shut up. The final is something that we are seeing every day, and that is the onrush of neo-fascist populism. We have one in the White House. We are having tendencies in Britain. If you get an advisor to the Prime Minister abusing the rules with impunity.
Can't think who you're thinking of, Guy.
No, I can't. I know you couldn't imagine, but it's symbolic of an abusive, tyrannical tendency and a populist where lies can be told with impunity and nobody's holding them to check. The lies of Brexit, the lies of so many other campaigns, which allowed this disinformation is creating an atmosphere that we are in a crisis moment. We cannot presume that we're going to come out of this crisis with a new progressive agenda unless we fight for it, because we may well get, as in the 1930s, the other direction. And that, I think, is scaring a lot of politicians and a lot of corporate people and actually driving them in our direction. Suddenly they're seeing virtues in a basic income.
So
those giants have come together and have now been strengthened so that the whole pandemic slump is much, much worse than if we'd started in a different set of economic circumstances.
So before we go over to Grace and start taking some questions from members, and please get in there and get your question down in the chat box so you can speak to Guy and put your point. Look, you know that I agree with everything that you say, and I love the way you say it, and the depth and the experience and the knowledge and the passion that goes into what you say, Guy. I guess the final question from me, is the how question. I agree that all of that contextual stuff is moving in that direction, but we're still some way in the UK from a government that would want to do something about that. Even the Labour Party, in the middle of everything you've just said, their immediate response when, we all, put pressure on for a recovery basic income, was now's not the time. And I think would Aneurin Bevan said that in 1945 about now's not the time to create a national health service or to recreate a new social settlement. So how are we going to get there and broaden that out into the politics, which I know that you share, is, what kind of political alliance are we going to need to embed a basic income, and a new economic social settlement out of this crisis? Tell us a bit about that before we go over to Grace.
Well, I've asked this question many times and tried to address it. I think progressive politics only really succeeds when it's based on class politics. I don't want to be talking in Marxist terms, but the precariat is potentially the progressive class of the day. But it has elements that are atavistic and support populists and so on. But the young, educated part of the precariat are going to define a new progressive politics. We must not forget that only a minority voted for Brexit. Only a minority. And I often ask people, what percentage of the British electorate voted for Boris Johnson and this government? The answer is 29%. 29%. So they don't have a legitimate democratic mandate. The reason, of course, is that the opposition is split and a third of the electorate didn't vote at all. So we have a situation, the same with Brexit, where a lot of people have not been motivated enough by what is on offer and induced to go out and campaign and vote and change the system. We know that the system of first past the post is a disgraceful system which doesn't allow for a majority to be heard and a majority to form a government. But we need a proportional representation. That's something that Compass stands for, I stand for. But I believe that what we need is to give those people on the left stronger backbones. Politicians have spaghetti backbones, usually. They don't lead, they wait until they feel there's enough popular momentum. I quote Franklin Roosevelt in his famous, I don't know if this is apocryphal or not, I've not been able to find a definitive proof of it, but he entertained a delegation in the White House. He listened to them for 40 minutes. And at the end he said, okay, you've convinced me. Now go out in the streets and force me to do it. And I think we are at that stage. I know that leading people in the Labour Party are in favor of basic income. And yet When it gets to it, when they have a position in the shadow cabinet, they go all timid. No, 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 not yet, not yet. Me. And I find that sad. I find that sad. I salute people like Caroline Lucas and Clive Lewis and others who've stayed the course and are advocating basic income. I like it that Nicola Sturgeon has come out. I like it now that the Lib Dems are coming out. And I'm actually quietly confident that we're soon going to shame the Labour leadership into saying, you can't be a progressive party if you're leaving the precariat out and you're sanctioning and accepting a policy which is giving middle and higher income people 5 times as much as it's giving the poor. That's not a progressive policy or a stance. You should be ashamed. This cannot go on. But we have to try and encourage them to be more bold, more brave. But I also think that even though the government has dismissed basic income, and Ian Duncan Smith is rushing around telling people it will be a disincentive to work, which is real nonsense, I think they may well be dragged into considering it before very long. And I would say to the Labour leadership, and I would say to all progressives, let us unite on the following proposition. The following proposition is that, okay, the government doesn't want to move in this direction at the moment. It thinks a system can get by without it. Labour wants to be supportive without being acritical. But why don't we pilot? Why don't we try it out in a number of places so that if we wish sometime to go in this direction, we have built up the evidence and seen how it could be implemented, how it could be rolled out, and what would be the necessary conditions to make it a success. That would be courageous. That would be a unifying call for the moment, because it is pragmatic, so they can keep on saying we can't change the system all at once, which is nonsense given that they've introduced the furlough scheme all at once. But at the same time, we can build a consensus. Let us try it. In Sheffield, they want to do it. In Liverpool, they want to do it. In Glasgow, they want to do it. Their councils have said so. Let us try it. A lot of money is being thrown at regressive policies, blatantly regressive, blatantly propping up corporations that don't pay British tax. Where's the moral fiber in that? Why aren't they attacking those sort of policies and saying this is an alternative, it could be the route? Let us try it.
Hello, this is Grace from the Compass office, interrupting for a moment. I'm lucky enough to come from a large and politically diverse family. We really did have the full political spectrum represented over Christmas dinner, but in spite of our differences, we still actually like each other. I've always known, because of this, that politics should be more about listening and learning from the people we disagree with than shouting at them and fighting with them. And of course, I've definitely known for a long time that it really is bloody complicated. So I was so happy that when one day I discovered Compass, quite by accident, through their brilliant work on the Progressive Alliance in the 2017 general election. Since then, it's been an absolute pleasure to once again be part of a political family where talking to people in different political parties, admitting that you alone don't have all the answers, is not just okay, but actively encouraged. So if you'd like to find out more about Compass, you can visit compassonline.org.uk. And now, back to the conversation.
Thank you, Guy. Over to the questions from the members and start putting them to Guy. Thanks so much, Grace.
All right, okay, so we've got lots of very good questions coming. I'm going to start with Eileen. Eileen, are you there? Can you hear me?
Yeah, first question was, what impact does universal basic income have on measures of relative poverty, which are used a lot? And the second question was, where has this been implemented successfully?
Everything, of course, depends on the design of any policy. If you introduce a basic income that's universal, in other words, where I don't use the term universal usually, but because you're going to have a pragmatic rule to deal with legal migrants. They'd have to be in the country for a certain amount of time. And you wouldn't be giving it to people like myself who are working abroad, even though I'm a British citizen. So the universal can create a problem. I call it basic income. But if you introduce a basic income that's equal for men and for women with a smaller amount for every child, then you're automatically giving a larger relative amount to a low-income person, obviously. A higher percentage of their pre-existing income. And it's gender basis of reducing gender inequality because women tend to have lower incomes than men. And if you're giving an equal amount to men and to women individually, it's a very critical part of basic income. It's not done on a household, it must be given individually. Then you're reducing gender inequalities. Now you would tax back from the wealthy. You could change the income tax rate, or you can have a wealth tax or a land value tax. That's the matter of choice. I've gone through various options in the 8 Giants book. And if you use personal income tax allowance to part pay for a basic income, you can come back to how to pay for it, but then you would actually remove a regressive subsidy system and you would be putting it into an equal basic income. So it would reduce relative poverty and it would have multiplier effects on that. As far as where it's been done, you're listening to a strange body, a person who's had the lack of wisdom to be involved in doing pilots in 4 continents, not 4 countries, 4 continents. So you can tell I've got a lot of misspent youth in me. But everywhere we've done it and everywhere that others have done it, the results have been similar. Many of the pilots, and I summarize most of them in an appendix in the book, many of the pilots have not been pure basic income. They've had certain flaws or design characteristics. Like in Finland, they called it a basic income trial, but it was only paid to 2,000 unemployed people and it without conditions randomly across the country. Where it's vitally important that everybody in a community receives the basic income because there are network effects and it has dynamic effects on the economy and on society. We've done pilots in India, in Africa, been involved in a pilot in Canada, small pilots in California, small pilot in Brazil. I even got involved in doing a pilot in Britain a few years ago, which was made into a television series. And I actually at one point withdrew from it because I found that they were giving capital grants rather than a steady flow. And I thought that that would lead to it not working optimally because I thought families would blow the money. But it actually turned out that every single family where they got the basic income improved their lives. And there are other pilots which I can summarize. I think the best pilot I can mention, it's called the accidental pilot in my book, and that was in North Carolina. And what happened was they introduced a basic income paying all the people in the Indian community from the proceeds of a casino. And it coincided with the start of a longitudinal child development study by a local university that went for 16 years. And in the end, the results showed that the families that had the basic income, the children who had been born around the time of the beginning of that pilot, were on average 1 year ahead in their schooling compared with the children in families that had not had the basic income. And it was it turned out when all the control variables had been factored in, it was due to the fact that the basic income had improved intra-family relationships, reduced stress, reduced problems of servicing debts and things, created a better learning environment, and that it had paid off in long term. But one of the most successful pilots was in Canada, and it resulted in huge improvements in mental health and in reduction in hospital visits and in a number of other cardiac arrest problems. It reduced it compared with those people who had not received it. So there are lots of pilots with lots of evidence, and you can criticize all of them with some defect or other, but they all have similar results. And that, I think, is remarkable.
So, Grace, more questions and slightly less long answers, Guy, but
But
they're brilliant answers. I could listen all night. Go on, Grace.
All right, okay, next up, Mick Bradley. So you had a question that a few different people were asking, so you are now the representative of this question, so go for it.
Right, no pressure. In your book, Guy, under the seventh giant, extinction, you make connections between a carbon tax and basic income. Can you say a bit more about how well the two might go together? And also, in practical terms, which do you think is the more likely to happen sooner? And how soon is soon, I guess?
I'm going to try not to give a long answer to this question, although it's tempting, because it's fundamental to what I believe is the best route to develop a basic income system. And I like to use that term system because we need supplements for disabilities, supplements for frailties. You need it so that everybody has equivalent access to resources. A carbon tax is by its nature regressive. If you apply a sensible carbon tax, it is a higher percentage cost for a low-income person than it is for a high-income person. So that if you introduced a carbon tax, it would be politically unpopular. And Macron found this in France. He got the Gilets jaunes attacking him as a result of going in that direction, and he backed down. More cleverly, in Canada, in British Columbia, they recognized that if you say we need a carbon tax because we've got to curb greenhouse gas emissions, but we're going to recycle the revenue gained from the tax in equal dividends, carbon dividends, green dividends, call them basic income. And there they suddenly become super popular, okay, because everybody's gaining from it. Now, I've argued in Plunder of the Commons that actually it's not only greenhouse gas emissions that we should be taxing with levies and using to recycle, but all incursions into our commons, our natural commons, our social commons, our cultural commons, and build up a levy system and a capital fund. And the capital fund would be modeled on the Norwegian pension fund. Whereas Britain privatized North Sea oil and enriched the tiny elite, the Norwegians had the common sense to retain ownership of their North Sea oil and use the proceeds to rent out to companies and use the proceeds to build up a capital fund. So that today, every Norwegian is nominally a millionaire, because if you distributed just the dividends from their capital fund, then they would be able to pay everybody a very high basic income. We also have the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is modeled on taking the proceeds of a resource, oil again, but it doesn't have to be oil, it can be lots of other things, and building it up, and as you build it up, paying out the dividends. And for me, that is the best approach, and it's ecologically the best approach because we are taxing bads. We are taxing things that we would like to be reduced rather than taxing income or food or something like that. So the extinction argument is vital, but also if we had basic income, it would encourage us to do work that is not resource depleting labor. And that, I think, is an ecological argument that is very important.
Okay, so next question hopefully from Marjorie Drake. Can you hear us, Marjorie?
Yes, I read something from the trade unions which said that basic income would encourage employers to pay low wages, and so that was one reason they were opposed to it. And what would you say to that argument?
I've talked to trade union leaders for many years. I'm a supporter of unionism. I've been a member of trade unions all my adult life, and I believe we need collective voice. I think they are profoundly wrong in supporting labor rather than work, and they haven't moved with the times, but I'm not going to stop being a supporter of unionism. I think they're profoundly wrong in this as well. When we've done the pilots and when we've seen the results, one of the things is that if you're insecure, if you don't have basic security, you have to say yes. You have to put up with disgusting conditions. You have to accept being exploited, oppressed, because you're desperate. You need to feed your children. You need to get through the week. Only if you have basic security will you have the strength to stand up and bargain and demand and join organizations. There have been good psychological studies showing that people who have basic security demand more, expect more, and don't put up with the rest of it, right? I think this is profoundly wrong. And I was giving a talk to a summer school of trade union leaders in the north of England, international trade union leaders. And I said, why is it that union leaders are so against basic income? And after a while, the Italian trade union leader said, you know, I think it's because if people had basic security, they wouldn't join a union. And I saw nodding from a lot of the others in that room. And I said, well, if you think about it, that's immoral, because you mean to say that they only join union because they're insecure and you want to keep them insecure? And I said, but also you're wrong. People who have a little amount will fight for more. And they'll put up with less, they will demand. And I think that the loss of unions is because they aren't recognizing that they need to appeal to the precariat more than anybody. I often talk to a meeting of precariat people, and if I talk about the unions, they want to leave the room because they're so furious with the unions. That should not be the case, but it is. So I think that they need to move into the 21st century and start advocating security for everybody. And until they do, they deserve the contempt of the precariat because they are not giving security to the precariat.
The next question I was going to bring in someone who seems to have gone offline, who was asking about...
Put off by my last answer.
I think something you probably get asked about a lot is, what about universal basic services? So what is that and why is it not what you would recommend? So I am going to bring in Bob Rhodes, who had a comment about that, which you might want to then bounce off of, if you can hear us, Bob.
Yeah, I responded. It's not my job to answer the questions tonight, but I responded to that comment on the basis of, you know, what I observe in the work that I do is that one of the basic problems we've created is, or we've tolerated, is the growth of a consumerist and a sort of insipid, passive consumerist society. And part of that has been the statism and not just statism on one side and it's the market on the other side, turning everybody into consumers. It seems to me that universal basic income creates the opportunity for people to start to be far more entrepreneurial in their lives in a social and an ethical way. And yeah, so I sort of put that point in and see what Guy's got to say about it.
Well, Bob, I couldn't agree more. I think you've said it much better than I can say it. So I think that's right. The idea of a basic income is not that it's a panacea. It's not that it's going to magically transform society, but it is part of imagining a different reality, a different way of living, slowing down, a reorientation to real leisure, to political participation in the life of the polis, as the ancient Greeks realized. And they had the idea of a basic income for citizens as a reward and an encouragement for people to participate in the political life and the schole, the public education. And I think that that's right. For me, the term universal basic services, which came into popularity last year, we had a debate at the Labour Party conference, I had a debate at the Green Party conference, and various other debates that I've been involved in. It's extremely paternalistic. It's state paternalism at the word. How you work out what my basic service needs are, or yours, and give priority to one type of basic service rather than other. Once you get down to it, you say, well, what is your basic services? Are you offering free universal basic food for everybody? Well, then I looked the small print, and what they meant was that one meal a day for the lowest third of the population, some such formula. Well, that's not universal. And the same when they were talking about universal bus service. Well, why? I don't take buses, I go on a bicycle. Okay, why should bus people and not tube people or train people get it? And then you go on and on and on with these basic services. Well, you need to price water, because if you don't, we all get wasteful. And there's that sort of thing. Of course, we should have a universal health service, because we don't want to be ill. We need a basic health service, free at the point of need. But for medicines, it's useful to have a partial price mechanism, because otherwise we all collect piles of medicines, half used, throw away, etc. So for me, once you unpack what they're talking about, it looks suspiciously like what I saw in the Soviet Union when I was working there in the late 1980s, and the early 1990s. And there you saw the consequences of the low quality universal that was not respected by the giver or the taker. And I've seen it in India, it doesn't work there either. So for me, it's a false image, and it just has this sexy title, Universal Basic Services. It sounds good. But then when you unpack it, think again.
Okay, another question. Matthew Hulbert, can you hear us?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Brilliant, you're there. So you had two questions which were kind of I think there's quite an overlap. So could you sort of squish them into maybe one question?
Yeah, so is this in reference to the Labour Party question?
Oh, no, I must have missed that one. No.
Oh,
so
okay.
The Tory party question.
Yeah, so first of all, great podcast, really interesting listening, thank you. Do you think that the Tories will ever support a basic income? I mean, I asked that probably thinking that, they probably never will. But sadly, this country has a habit of electing Tory governments. And so, a lot of the things that Compass wants to accomplish, I spend my time thinking that will be fantastic. But how on earth do we get a Tory government to enact that? And is that possible, do you think? Or am I in cloud cuckoo land?
Well, first of all, if I were a real cynic, I would say, I hope they don't introduce basic income, because if they did introduce a basic income, they would be very popular very quickly, because I'm sure that it will improve the lives of an enormous number of people. And we've just seen an opinion poll recently where a big majority of people are now in favor of basic income. And in other European countries, there's even bigger majorities. So we're seeing a popular movement. I don't think they will, because they daren't unleash the sense of emancipation and pro-work and bargaining strength of ordinary people. They don't like that. But I think they may be dragged in that direction, because the simple formula is this: if any one group of people is left vulnerable during the course of this year, we will all be left vulnerable. And the pandemic will have second waves, third waves, and so on. And the excess deaths that will come, that have already come, will be horrific. The morbidity crisis following the actual deaths attributed to COVID-19 could well exceed, I'm sure will exceed, the number who are dying of COVID. And the reason it will continue is that vulnerable people will continue to be vulnerable, and the rest of us will continue to be made vulnerable by their vulnerability. So I do think there's a possibility, particularly if we had a collapse of their fiber, their capacity to rule, which it may well happen, and we then have demands for either a new general election or a coalition of some sort for getting through the crisis. That's a possibility. I'm not predicting it, but we have to demand it. And why I am a strong supporter of Compass today is that we desperately need a political realignment. It's the biggest tragedy that we've had in my lifetime politically, that we allow a minority to be re-elected again and again because the opposition to conservatism, big C, small c, far right, whatever you want to call it, is split in different directions. Some of us are green left, some of us are more liberal, some of us are more labourist, and we're split. And why I wanted to dedicate my talk today, as I did on Saturday, when I'm speaking to the Surrey Fabians, I want to dedicate it to Robert Park, because he was a classic person in a quirky sort of way who wanted a political realignment to beat Jeremy Hunt. And he wanted to step down, and Labour to step down and allow an NHS doctor to stand against Hunt. And if that had taken place and the Lib Dems and the Greens agreed with that, then they could have easily defeated the most odious health secretary we've had, who slashed the NHS over many years and left it vulnerable so it cannot service us today. Robert Park was thrown out of the Labour Party for doing that after 40 years of being in the Labour Party. And he died last week. He suddenly was rushed to hospital. He'd asked me to speak, and then suddenly was rushed to hospital, and he died the next day. I thought, bloody hell, he didn't deserve that. He got hit by you know what. So we have a situation where we need political realignment. We need to demand it. We need to fight for it. We need to go in the streets when we're back out of this lockdown and demand these changes. Because now is the moment when I think there's going to be a lot of pent-up energy, and Neil and others will lead it.
I think you've got a lot of pent-up energy, Guy, and it's been amazing to hear you talk. I always learn something from you about basic income, another fact, another argument, another insight. So I love to hear it. I love to hear your passion. And thank you for dedicating that to Robert. There's a nice little memorial blog by Steve Williams about Robert on our website. So thank you to Guy for being so inspiring and so informative. Thank you to all of you for being part of that. I'm sorry we couldn't get more in, but I think all of us are a lot richer now and understand a lot more about the case for basic income. So thanks all very much. Next week we'll be joined by Labour MP and Shadow Justice Secretary David Lammy. So please do join us again for that one, which I'm sure will be another interesting conversation. Let's hope it's anywhere near as good as that conversation we just had with Guy, which was fantastic. Thank you again so much, Guy, for your energy and your support for us. Again, we turn that support back to you. Thanks everyone. Good night. Keep safe, keep well, and we'll join up again next week. Thank you, Guy. Good night. Take care.
Thanks to everybody.
So, if you like what you've heard today and want to be part of a much more equal, democratic and sustainable future, a good society, then visit us at compassonline.org.uk/podcast, and you'll be able to join us live on future calls just like this one. You can tweet me at Neil, NEAL_Compass, or Compass at Compass Office. And if you've enjoyed this week's episode, please give us a rating. It will help us reach more listeners in the future. And it's only fair that they know it's bloody complicated too.